Hello, Year 8, and welcome to your next lesson on Britain between 1750 and 1900. The title of this lesson is Why Did Sheffield Stink? And today we're going to look at why these new cities that grew up in the industrial period were such unhealthy places to live. So write down the title, the aim, and the date, please, and then we have a starter task for you to do. So on the screen now you'll see a small version of an image. The bigger version will be on the following screen. What I would like you to do, ideally as a chart form or just as a list, have a look at the image and can you make a note of all the things that you can see in the source that would make this place an unpleasant or unhealthy place to live. There are lots. Ideally, if you could expand on each point, so don't just identify the features, give a quick development of why this would be unpleasant, why these things would make it unpleasant to live there. So the big image will be on the next screen. You will need to pause it while you do that. Whilst you're doing that though, the source is actually a cartoon called The Court for King Cholera. So once you've done all this, can you suggest why the cartoon is referring to this idea of King Cholera? So title, aim and date, pause the video on the next screen and make a note of all the reasons why this place would be unpleasant or unhealthy to live. So hopefully you haven't just skipped straight forward and got to this slide with some of the key features identified. These are by no means all of the key features. There are lots. So if we start in the bottom left hand corner, hopefully you've identified this large pile of what can only be described as rubbish and most likely poo. And the first thing I've circled on this image is this child doing a handstand in a massive pile of poo in the streets. Clearly this shouldn't need too much explanation as to why that is not a good idea and why that is unhealthy. Next to the handstand child you've got an old woman. Well, we say old, she's clearly not aging well. We've got a woman rummaging through the same pile of rubbish and poo, presumably looking for things that are of value or possibly food. You can speculate as to what it is she's got in her hand. Is it an old banana? Very unlikely. Or what could it be? But she's sifting through this pile of rubbish and poo. To the right of her, and again at the bottom, you've got some children sat around in the street next to the pile of poo, and a couple of them are playing with a dead rat. Hopefully you've all worked out that that is not a healthy thing to do, and that is going to lead to the spread of disease. Next to them, just behind them, we've got a child with a brush, looking quite unkempt, quite dishevelled. He actually looks quite bloated. This is a sign of malnutrition, not eating too much. The sweeping brush is quite important. This tells us that this child is a chimney sweep. So clearly some of the jobs children in this case were doing were very unhealthy. It was his job to go up a chimney and clean it all out. On the bottom right hand corner of the image you've got a woman just sat around on the ground. But next to her again you have a small child playing in what we can assume is a pretty unpleasant street. So the chances of getting a serious infection or serious illness from a very young age was very high. If we look slightly above, we've got these ramshackled, cramped buildings. This part of the town is massively overcrowded. I've circled one thing that says good beds. This is clearly some excessive advertising. In these towns it was not uncommon for people to live in lodging houses where whole families would probably rent a room for the night. So the idea of having a permanent home was not the case. Good beds was obviously an exaggeration. These places were notoriously dirty, cramped, unclean, and very, very smelly. And just to exaggerate that point, or further emphasize that point, if you look slightly to the right of this, you can see a quite sickly looking child hanging out of the window, showing that between malnutrition, poor sanitation and disease, this was not a great place to live. For the extension point, this is labelled a court for King Cholera. Cholera was a very, very deadly and very widespread waterborne disease in the 1900s. It was spread by drinking unclean water, and hopefully from the state of this cartoon you can see it's not a surprise why cholera was such a problem in the 1800s. So add on any extra labels that you have from this diagram. Obviously if you've labelled other things, that's perfectly fine. There are far too much on here to do quickly in less than 10 minutes. So now obviously we need to address the point that this is just a cartoon of the time. It's done for a certain purpose, and we need to add a little bit more detail to this. So on the screen now you've got two short written sources. All I want you to do now, pause the video, read these two sources and consider the two questions below. So the first one would be, how do they improve our understanding of towns at the time? And do they agree or disagree with the cartoon? You don't necessarily need to write anything from this, but hopefully you'll be able to pick out some key snippets from these sources that either will agree with the source, yes it was a terrible place to live, disagree with the cartoon, or maybe, particularly if you look at some of the specific details, do they make it seem worse than the cartoon? So just read these two sources now. You may use them later on, but they give us a nice little description of life in towns at the time. So moving on, we now need to develop our understanding of these particularly back alley, back-to-back houses of the time, and we're going to have a little bit of a snapshot look into it. So it says on the page 5051 of the textbook you will see a diagram and an explanation. For this you will need to open the document called Book Scan. It's a high resolution scan of the textbook. You can zoom into it and so on. It's a PDF file, which is the most universally accessible type of document. This will give you a lot of detail about the kind of housing and the streets in these poorer areas of Victorian towns at the time. So what you need to do, using that information in your book or whatever form you are working on, you're going to need to draw a table similar to the tiny one you've got an example of just above the picture. One column needs to be for the feature you can identify. The second column needs to be for the effect. So what effect would this have on making towns unhealthy? The first thing you need to do, looking at the textbook scan, is identify the key features. Once you've done these, the effect should be pretty obvious. Some of this is going to be common sense thinking. So the example given below is, once you've found a problem, for example a dunghill or a big pile of poo, you write down dunghill / big pile of poo under feature, and then in the next column you write down what problems this would cause. Problems such as it would smell bad, it would spread disease, people could fall over in it, and you could get a face full of poo. So pause this video now, open the book scan document, draw your chart and complete it with as much detail as you can. And this is one of the tasks we want you to resubmit back into Google Classroom so we can check your understanding. So just to review what you've done so far, we've got 3 little prompt points to start making you think. 4 with, if you count the speech bubble. So first thing, you should be able to now, can you give 3 features which would make living in cities unhealthy? Hopefully you can do more than 3. Next one, can you explain the term back-to-back housing? Why do you think they were called this? And last but not least, can you summarise life in the cities in less than 10 words? You don't necessarily have to write these, just make sure you could do these. Obviously this all poses the massive question, if it was so bad in cities, why on earth would people live in such terrible conditions? So the previous task and resources have looked at this idea of overcrowding. We know cities grew massively and very often they couldn't keep up with the demand for housing. But overcrowding is just one part of this bigger puzzle. The terrible state of towns and cities was not just caused by a few dirty streets with overcrowded houses. There were lots and lots of reasons why towns became so unhealthy. And to give you an idea, if you look at the two images, can you suggest why these industrial towns were so unhealthy? So we've got Manchester in 1850 and Sheffield in 1850. So just have a look, have a think, and hopefully you'll be able to identify one massive and significant reason why these places were so unhealthy. So as we've said previously in most history lessons, there's always multiple causes. So we need to start now thinking about how we can manage these causes, how we can order them. So you're going to need to open the sheet that's called factor cards, and on that you will find various factors for the poor state of public health in these industrial cities. So it gives you, these cards give you different reasons for the poor conditions. So the first thing I want you to do, I don't mind how you do this, I will leave that up to you. You may want to write them down under different headings. You may want to edit the document if you can. It's presented in PDF format, so it's unlikely you can edit the document, but it is the most accessible. So for each one, I want you to decide whether that factor or that cause is to do with the government, whether it's to do with ordinary people, whether it's to do with science and technology, or whether it's to do with money. So for example, if it's a bit of information saying the government weren't interested in dealing with overcrowding, then that would clearly go under government. If it said it was too much, it cost too much to build sewers, that would go under money. As always with history, be careful because they can go under more than one heading. So what I want you to do is order them under the correct headings, and can you resubmit this in whatever manner you've decided to write it down. It may be that you write down the 4 headings as a chart and put the information underneath, that's fine. Ideally as well, if you could diamond rank the causes from most important to least important, that would also massively improve your understanding. So pause the video, order the information under the various headings, and then resubmit that to Google Classroom. And finally, just for you to check your understanding, do you know, can you work out, what have you developed and learned from this as a plenary? Can you now think of 3 features of some housing in the 1800s? Can you also now give 3 reasons why towns were so unhealthy? Hopefully you should have an idea of what you think the main reason was. And finally, can you use the term back-to-back housing and slum in a description? Are you comfortable using these key terms? So that's it for why towns were so unhealthy. Remember to actually submit the work to Google Classroom rather than returning an empty post. And thank you very much, and goodbye.